Oh, hello everyone and welcome to RaceWeek, where we will recap a fairly formulaic but interesting Friday at the Circuit de Spa-Francorchamps. Let's go in to the session reviews. The first running we saw of the F1 weekend was the first practice session, which obviously took place this morning. And to start with, it was a very bad session for Haas. Romain Grosjean went out of the pits and reported a loss of power, and then in the end, it turned out his teammate had the same problem. Neither car could set a time in the session, and that really set them back throughout. It was a really bad morning for them, and the problem actually did not. The problem actually was not fixed until midway through the second session. It was a very bad day for the Haas team. But in the first also Antonio Giovinazzi did not set a time for an unspecified reason. But looking at the result, Mercedes were in front, but not by much, because Max Verstappen was less than a tenth off them. It seems like yesterday I speculated about Red Bull trimming out their car to gain an advantage over the Mercedes to think outside, as a way of thinking outside the box. But it turns out they did the complete opposite. Rather than gaining time in the first and third sector, they in that session were using the second sector to gain time on Mercedes by running more downforce, losing a lot of time. I believe David Croft said around 4/10 in the first sector. In the first sector alone, but then he gained that time back in the middle sector with the increased downforce and was less than a tenth off. I'm not really sure that could be the best setup for the race, because that may mean that overtaking is going to be quite tricky, especially if they end up behind a Racing Point. But Racing Point, speaking of Racing Point, they showed good pace. Once again, as expected, this is historically a good track for them. And, of course, considering that they're using a very similar package to Mercedes, and Mercedes typically goes well around here, they were always going to go well around this circuit. Alex Albon was in 6th ahead of Esteban Ocon. A good day for the Renault-powered teams. And I said yesterday, the Renault engine is quite good in a straight line now, and all 4 Renault-powered cars were in the top 10. But one of the other major stories of the session was Ferrari. At first, there was a little bit of wondering about whether this was kind of a misfire from them. 14th for Charles Leclerc and 15th for Sebastian Vettel. Obviously, it's very disappointing for them. But we didn't know what their program was. But that was the first practice session. And now let's talk about the second practice session. Now, talking about the second practice session, there was a couple of red flags that came out during the session. Daniel Ricciardo had to brought his car to a stop on the Kemmel Straight. And then there was a bizarre incident where the red flag was suddenly... It was actually only the virtual safety car that was brought out for Ricciardo. But then there was a bizarre incident where the red flag was suddenly brought out, and that's because an advertising hoarding, which had been loosened by Giuliano Alesi, going off into the barrier in a bizarre incident where he lit up the rears trying to warm up his tyres on the exit of the pits. It seemed that one of the advertising hoardings was loosened and they didn't know it at the time. And then obviously the wind from one of the cars would have brought it down. But that disrupted a lot of drivers' long runs. But Red Bull once again showing good pace, with Max Verstappen topping the timesheets. But he was followed by Daniel Ricciardo. Despite his stoppage, it was a good session for him. Actually, within half a tenth of Max Verstappen. And that's surely a confidence booster for Daniel Ricciardo and the Renault team. Then, in third place, he had Lewis Hamilton, almost a tenth off Verstappen's time. It's interesting to see. I mean, I obviously am convinced that Mercedes are hiding something. I still believe that they are the fastest car around this circuit. Then you have Alex Albon. He had a good session, and as they said, he needs to use that as a baseline for qualifying. 0.3 off Max, that's an improvement. And if he can pull that off in qualifying, he should have a good start. You have to remember, this was his first race in the Red Bull car last year. In fifth place, it was Sergio Perez ahead of Valtteri Bottas, who was 0.4 off. He had a bit of a rough session. Then you had Lando Norris, Esteban Ocon, Carlos Sainz, with Pierre Gasly rounding out the top 10 in this session. Then you had Lance Stroll, who had a slightly disappointing session, being a little bit off his teammate. In fact, actually 0.6 off his teammate. We don't know what happened on his quali run. Then you had Danny Kvyat, Antonio Giovinazzi and Kimi Raikkonen. But Ferrari struggling once again. It was quite shocking. We saw a comparison, one of the graphics which compared them, but it seems like the Williams was actually on par with the Ferrari through some of that. Obviously, we don't know the fuel loads and everything, but that is worrying signs for Ferrari fans. I mean, we all knew that this weekend and next weekend was going to be a struggle. I mean, if this weekend's going to be a struggle, then Ferrari are going to be in for a home embarrassment next week in Monza with the lack of straight line speed. But they were behind Alfa Romeo with the same engine, but they don't have as much of a draggy car. So we don't know if this is their legit pace or not, but there's worrying signs. Then the two Hasses did in the end get out on track, but they propped up the table, obviously with the reduced running. They have a lot of catching up to do tomorrow. The big question is, will it rain tomorrow, which could really affect the qualifying session? But that is the F1 practice session. Now let's talk about the Formula 2 session. And it was a fairly incident-packed qualifying session for Formula 2, where we saw two red flags, or we saw a virtual safety, or we didn't, there was not even that coming out, but we saw two stoppages. We first had the session kicked off. Jury Vips had to bring his car to a stop, which was a real shame for him, that we could not see what he could have done in his first qualifying session in Formula 2. But if he has a good race car, he should be able to make his way through the field. We know he's got the skills for that. And then the red flag was actually brought out when Guilherme Samaya came to a fiery stop on the side of the track. And this brought out the red flag. The red flag came in again, but then we had a bizarre incident. There are quite a few bizarre incidents today, but this was probably the most bizarre. The track went green, but instantly went red again because the crane didn't appear to have been reparked in its correct spot, which was quite odd, to say the least. But in the end, the session got underway, and in the first flurry of runs, it was Yuki Tsunoda who took provisional pole, 0.2 ahead of Mick Schumacher in second place in the first flurry of runs. It was a really good initial run for Yuki Tsunoda, but then came the second runs. Nikita Mazepin had a good go at beating Tsunoda to pole position. And he initially managed, but Yuki Tsunoda immediately responded by taking the provisional pole position, and he would not lose out. Yuki Tsunoda took pole position, and it was a crucially timed pole position, as he is being talked about in recent weeks. It has been said that he will take part in the post-season young drivers test with AlphaTauri, and he is being talked about as a potential AlphaTauri driver for 2021. And that, I'm pretty sure that Danny Kvyat might have been shivering watching the Formula 2 session, seeing someone who clearly wants his drive. Yuki Tsunoda got provisional pole ahead of Nikita Mazepin. Nobuharu Matsushita got third, his best qualifying of the season, ahead of Robert Schwartzman, who does seem to have had a massive upturn in his quality pace. That's the second time in a row in the top four after previously struggling in qualifying. Then you have Felipe Drugovich, a good qualifying for MP Motorsport. Ahead of Guan Yu Zhou, Mick Schumacher dropped to 7th in the end. Then you had Louis Delatres in 8th, Jehan Deruvala in 9th, with Luca Giotto in 10th place. Pedro Piquet lines up in 11th, but the other big story of the session, Callum Ilott, having been in the top 3 in every session actually since the Spa qualifying session last year, which he actually came to a stop and could not set a time. For the first time since then, he is out of the top. I believe for the first time since then, he is out of the top 5. I believe that might be the first time since then out of the top 3. He is, certainly this season, he's been in the top 3 every race. When we don't know what happened with him, but down in 12th, surely he is going to be going for the reverse grid pole and on the alternate strategy. Then you have Marcus Armstrong in 13th. Dan Ticktum had to miss practice in the morning due to an inconclusive COVID test. Eventually he tested negative and he was able to get back out onto the track and he qualified in 14th. Then you have Roy Nissany, Marino Sasso, Jack Aitken ran in the gap but could only manage 17th. Then you had Christian Lundgaard who had his final lap time deleted. Then you have Markelov, Alesi with Samaya and Vips not setting a time. It's going to be an interesting race tomorrow, because obviously Yuki Tsunoda, could he get his first feature race win? He was fast around this track last year, but Robert Schwartzman we know is good in the races, and I think that he will be in that fight as well. Same can be said for Nikita Mazepin, and how high up can Callum Ilott get? We'll have to see tomorrow. Earlier today, we had quite a fascinating F3 session, which saw quite a few bizarre incidents once again, where we have started to see shades of Monza last year in the Formula 3 session, where everyone was fighting over their track position, and you had half the grid in one part of the track. As you can see, they actually all went out at once when the light went green. But it was a session which saw an initial flurry of runs, but then the red flags were brought out after Michael Belov hit the wall at Pouhon. A few drivers had set times and they were put at an advantage because it was starting to rain, and gradually through the session the track got wetter before it started raining enough for there to be no improvements. And it was Lorem Zendelli who ended up on pole position. He was one of the drivers who set that an early that time, ahead of Teo Porcher in second. Alexander Smolia starts in third, ahead of Logan Sargent, crucially ahead of his championship rival Oscar Piastri. Then you have David Beckman, Richard Verschoor in 6th, Liam Lawson in 7th, Oscar Piastri in 8th. Then you have Frederick Vesti in 9th, and Alex Peroni rounds out the top 10. You have Caldwell Hughes. He was disappointed in 12th, wondering where his pace had gone. Jack Doohan had topped the practice session, but would have been a bit disappointed with 13th. Then you have Nannini, Fittipaldi, Fernandez in 16th. Then you have Malvestiti, Fraga, Dunner, Esner, Williams, Schumacher, Novalak, Stanek, Das, Deleda, Chauvet. Fiscal would have been disappointed with 28th. Hauger was not able to actually set a time before the rain fell. So he starts in 29th with Michael Belov rounding out the grid after crashing in qualifying. But Formula 3 always sees exciting racing. 30 cars barreling down the Kemmel Straight is always going to be a sight. And it's going to be that. I have a feeling that being in the lead is not going to be ideal. Unless you can break out a gap, being in the lead is not going to be an ideal position in Formula 3, judging by the slipstream levels of the car. But can Lorenzo Zendelli take his first win of the season after missing out on the last lap at Silverstone? We'll have to wait and see. And that is it from the Friday recap. And we will see you tomorrow for the Saturday recap, which will be done after the Formula 2 race tomorrow, where hopefully we will recap a fascinating day of on-track action at Spa. The qualifying session at Spa is always something for the eyes and the ears. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow. Goodbye.